Hello, everybody. Welcome to our Ides of March program. In 44 BC, about 3.5 hours ago, Caesar was assassinated. My name is Shelby Brown. I'm the Senior Education Specialist at the Villa. I'm here with two Southern California historians who are Caesar experts, Steve Chrysanthos from UC Riverside and Ed Watts from UC San Diego. And they will be presenting both the big picture and also honing in very tightly on very specific days where the expected and the unexpected changed history. So Steve's going to go first, Ed second, and then we'll have a Q&A that not only focuses further on Caesar, but also probably brings to light some of the lessons that the past still holds for republics today. Let me introduce them just quickly, and we're going to be pretty informal. Steve teaches in the Department of History at UC Riverside, especially on Greek, Roman, social, political, and military history. And he's published on warfare and military power, so that's perfect. And in his 2019 book, The Year of Julius and Caesar, 59 BC and the Transformation of the Roman Republic, he gets to the heart of what we're talking about today. Ed is the inaugural Vasiliadis Chair in Byzantine History at UCSD, and he teaches about Greek, Roman, and Byzantine politics and the religious and intellectual history of the times. And his book from 2018 is what led him to us today, Mortal Republic: How Rome Fell into Tyranny. So I'm going to turn this over right away to Steve to get us started, and I'll see you later.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. I hope you enjoy the show. There are often dramatic similarities in the political processes of Republican governments throughout history, and in particular, there are many parallels between the Roman and American republics. Both were established following revolutions to end tyrannies. In Rome's case, the expulsion of the last king, Tarquin the Proud, in 509 BC. In America, the revolution against the British king, George III. Each valued freedom, libertas in Latin, though there was often intense debate concerning the specific meaning of the term. Both possessed systems in which, at least theoretically, sovereignty rested with the people. In both, citizens participated in the political process through voting and office holding, enjoyed freedom of speech, and expected specific protections under the law. In both, citizens elected the government's officials. These and other similarities should not be surprising, since as the writings of America's founding fathers make clear, the United States is in many ways Rome's political descendant. That also meant that Rome dealt with many of the same issues, such as the role of religion in the public square, vast sums of money in politics, bribery and corruption, organized special interest groups in their efforts to influence the political process, the role of the people and their power and voice, extreme urban and rural poverty, class division, the role of the state in society, obstructionism against political rivals, and, if all that wasn't enough, the growing trepidation that the Republic was ill and that partisan politics and gridlock prevented a cure. Ambitious Roman politicians were increasingly unwilling to accept political defeat, increasingly willing to use methods that were unprecedented, illegal, and even violent to achieve political victory. As Sallust, a contemporary politician and historian, noted, the political divisions became so bad that politicians were motivated more by hatred than by patriotism. When parties do anything to defeat their opponents, they destroy great states. Ultimately, as Sallust predicted, the Romans were unable to solve their many problems, and their republic degenerated into bloodshed and civil war that eventually brought about the collapse of the Free State and the advent of a new Roman monarchy. Rule by one man, rule by an emperor. Next slide, please. Gaius Julius Caesar played a leading role in the Republic's collapse. He is probably Rome's most famous character, a descendant of the gods and of Rome's founder, a patrician, general, orator, historian, poet, and most importantly, an ambitious and popular politician. However, despite his image as a charming nobleman, there is a dark side to Caesar. and thus his career and Roman political history in general represent for us a cautionary tale. His use of violence to avoid defeat and to control the political process saved his political fortunes and made his incredible rise possible. In fact, had it not been for his use of unconstitutional and violent methods, history might not remember him. He would never have taken command of an army and conquered vast new territories for the empire, nor would he have been able to use that army to seize control of Rome itself and eventually make himself dictator for life. Far from being forgotten, people are still talking about Julius Caesar more than 2,000 years later at the Getty Museum. So, on the anniversary of Caesar's death, today's talks will examine the two crucial dates in his career that led to his dramatic rise and to his sudden fall. The first, we'll discuss April 4th, 59 BC. That'll be my paper. On that day, nearly 2,080 years ago, Caesar and Marcus Calpurnius Bibulus were consuls, the co-presidents of the Roman state. Caesar's violent attack on Bibulus and his followers in the Forum on April 4th would bring him immense power. How he used that power led directly to war, civil war, autocracy, and the events of the second crucial date. 2,065 years ago today, on the Ides of March, March 15th, 44 BC, it was Caesar, now dictator, who was attacked, assassinated by his fellow senators in the theater of Pompey in Rome. The second talk will discuss the Ides and the impact of Caesar's murder on the fall of the Roman Republic. Now, very briefly, quick sweep through early Roman history. The city of Rome was founded in 753 BC. The Roman Republic was established in 509 BC. By 146 BC, the Romans had eliminated all external threats to their power. Next slide, please. So you can see the Roman Empire by 146 BC stretching across most of the Mediterranean world. Unfortunately, beginning in 133 BC, internal political divisions became a far more serious threat to the Republic than any foreign enemy. Next slide, please. The best illustration of the poisoned partisan atmosphere was the dramatic rise in the frequency and scale of violence in the Roman political process. In 133, a group of Roman senators assassinated the tribune Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus on the Capitoline Hill in Rome, which you can see on the map there, almost right in the center. And they dumped his body into the Tiber River. For the first time since the foundation of the Roman Republic 376 years before, a city magistrate had been murdered. It would not be the last. The cataclysm of 133 BC shattered the political consensus and the peace which had previously existed amongst Rome's politicians. Though there were no organized political parties in Rome, there were different factions across the political spectrum with specific agendas and specific methods. The pursuit of the wealth and power of empire served to dramatically and dangerously increase their traditional competitions. Politicians now employed methods which were unprecedented, illegal, and even violent to win elections, to win votes on policy, to receive or extend important military commands, or to injure political opponents. They'd become unwilling to accept defeat and therefore used any means necessary to triumph over their enemies and to ignore almost any crime committed by political allies as long as it furthered their cause. It became progressively easier for politicians to employ extreme tactics and to convince themselves that these tactics were justified given what had gone before and given the possible motivations and designs of their rivals. Since no independent, politically neutral National Guard or Capitoline police force to keep order existed in Rome, this all led to a period of unprecedented political violence. Between 133 and 59, there were 33 more incidents as violence occurred at public gatherings, electoral and legislative voting assemblies, Senate meetings, and political trials. Even worse, if this all wasn't bad enough, even worse, thanks to the changing political climate and Gaius Marius's military reforms, some senators willing to do almost anything to protect or expand their power, sometimes now commanded large and loyal armies. Consequently, in 88 BC, the consul Lucius Cornelius Sulla Felix became the first Roman general to lead his army against Rome itself. Similar acts followed until, for the first time in Roman history, Roman generals commanding loyal Roman soldiers led their armies into battle against each other. This produced 5 civil wars between 87 and 62, the first such conflicts in Rome's long history. The horrors of civil war were sometimes followed by brutal dictatorships and ghastly massacres. Next slide, please. It was in this context that Caesar and Bibulus, after a bruising campaign that was eerily similar to modern American political campaigns, were elected consuls in the summer of 60 BC and inaugurated for their one-year terms on January 1st, 59 BC. Next slide, please. Shortly after taking office, Caesar convened the Senate in the Curia Hostilia in the Forum and formally proposed his highly anticipated land law. So you see the picture right there. The picture is being taken from the Palatine Hill, which was the Beverly Hills of Rome. All the important Romans had houses up on the Palatine Hill. And they're looking across the Forum, and straight across, you see that building that's intact. That was the new Senate building. All right, so it's not the old Curia Hostilia that was around during Caesar's time, but that's where the that's where Senate meetings took place. And the new one was based on the old one that was built very close by. So that's where the events, most of the events that we're going to be talking about actually took place, right in that spot, see on that picture. Caesar proposed the Lex Julia Agraria, which would grant farmland to military veterans who had recently served in the Eastern Wars and had conquered 4 new provinces for the Roman Empire. The bill also attempted to alleviate chronic unemployment and poverty in the city of Rome by granting land to poor citizens as well. The land would be paid for with a tribute from the newly occupied provinces. Unfortunately, conservative senators were usually unwilling to do anything to help Rome's less fortunate or even to help Rome's military veterans who had risked their lives for Rome. Bibulus and his father-in-law, Marcus Porcius Cato, led the opposition to Caesar and to Caesar's bill. Cato employed his most potent weapon, the filibuster, to stall senatorial debate and prevent the law from coming to a vote. And this was a big problem in Rome because gridlock was common because it was far easier to obstruct legislation than it was to pass it. Cato and his allies were able to block Caesar's efforts for more than 2 months, from January into early March, 59 BC. Finally, Caesar announced that he would waste no further time attempting to obtain the senators' approval. Instead, he would let the people decide in the assembly. Bibulus still refused to capitulate and continued to prevent a vote. As consul, he had numerous political and religious weapons at his disposal to obstruct the political process. Eventually, he simply declared the year's remaining assembly days to be sacred. Political business could not be conducted on sacred days. When confronted by a hostile crowd at a public meeting in the Forum, Bibulus remained defiant, telling the people that he would never allow a vote on the measure, quote, even if all of you wanted. Now, Caesar could not fail his supporters or himself by allowing this legislation to die as previous land laws had died in the face of conservative opposition. Accordingly, he decided to ignore Bibulus's legal and constitutional obstructions and scheduled a vote to take place at the Temple of Castor and Pollux on April 4th, 59 BC. So you look again at that picture and you see just to the left of center, the temple with 3 columns still standing. That's the Temple of Castor and Pollux, right? So it's still there. So the events that are about to happen took place right there at that temple and right in front of that temple. Next slide, please. And you take a look at the picture on the right there. That's a picture of the columns that are still there. They've been rebuilt, but you also see the podium, right? So that's where a lot of the events that are about to happen actually took place. To ensure success, Caesar and his allies, supporters, and the veterans moved down into the Forum before dawn on the morning of the vote. In the darkness, the veterans occupied the open space in front of the temple steps, the temple podium, which you see in the picture, And they seized the strategic elevated points of the Forum. Before the sun rose over the 7 hills of Rome, on April 4th, 59 BC, the veterans had provided Caesar with control over the voting area. At dawn, a herald called the Togate citizens together. As presiding magistrate, Caesar came onto the podium wearing the white toga praetexta with a purple border denoting his consular office, complete with long sleeves with fringes and a loosely fitting belt. He also wore the scarlet and purple tunic of the Pontifex Maximus, chief priest, and a crown of oak leaves given to him for bravery in battle. He was one of Rome's great orators, 40 years old, tall, with intense dark eyes and a receding hairline, but still with the good looks that had made him one of Rome's most notorious womanizers. Caesar conducted the proper religious ceremonies and then delivered a final speech in support of the law. He noted that the conservative opponents of the bill had argued that there should be no innovations, no revolutionary laws passed, yet they had never put forward any measure to help the veterans or the poor. In the past, they had not only used all their formidable power and wealth to block such measures, they had even resorted to violence and on some occasions murder to see to their defeat. Next slide, please. Before the voting could continue, another large group descended from the Palatine Hill and moved along the Via Sacra and came down into the Forum. Right, so you can see the Palatine Hill on this map here. Just to the north of that, you see the Via Sacra, which was the main route down into the Forum. The 12 lictors, Bibulus's official attendants, led the way, walking in single file. In their left hands, they carried the symbols of consular authority, the fasces, a bundle of rods about 5 feet long, made of wood, held together by red rope. The consul, Bibulus, his loyal tribunes, senators, and a large group of supporters followed. Bibulus quickly realized that Caesar's group vastly outnumbered his own, but he was unconcerned. He intended either to exercise his consular authority, which included the use of religious objections, or to employ the veto of one of the friendly tribunes to stop the proceedings. According to the Roman constitution, he did not require a majority vote. In fact, he did not require the support of even one other Roman citizen to utilize these weapons and prevent the vote. Bibulus and the tribunes made their way through the crowd, the 12 lictors clearing a path. Bibulus climbed the stairs to the podium, planning to stop his consular colleague. Next slide, please. And again, you take a look at the picture on the right. That's the podium, right? So that's where Caesar was standing already. That's where Bibulus now ascended. Unfortunately for Bibulus, he never got the chance to object. As part of a well-rehearsed plan, Caesar gave the signal, and the men standing around him on the platform immediately grabbed Bibulus, one of the 2 highest elected magistrates in the city, and cast him down the temple steps. To add injury to insult, they dumped a bucket of manure on Bibulus's head. Caesar's adherents quickly overwhelmed the 12 lictors and hurled them from the stage. In the process, they broke their fasces into pieces, a symbolic act representing an end to Bibulus's power to block legislation desired by the Roman people. They then proceeded to pummel the sacrosanct tribunes, 2 of whom were seriously wounded, rendering them unwilling or unable to interpose their vetoes to officially halt their proceedings. Next slide, please. On the Forum floor, which you see in the picture there, Caesar's supporters threw rocks and other projectiles at Bibulus's followers and then surged forward to beat and batter their opponents. Their rage was genuine. Caesar's first act as consul, passed on his first day in office, was to begin publishing a report of senatorial proceedings. Thus, these citizens knew clearly who was responsible for blocking the land law and other popular measures in the Senate. They now take their revenge. Cato alone tried to defy the hostile crowd, using his great determination to force his way up to the podium, and once there, employing his loud, piercing voice to verbally abuse Caesar, to no avail. Caesar's men picked him up and tossed him from the platform. You saw in the earlier picture, that's a pretty great height. The conservative senators and their followers, wounded, battered, and bruised, their snow-white togas now tattered and stained with blood, were driven southeast out of the forum, and up the Velian slope to take refuge at the temple of Jupiter Stator on the Via Sacra. So basically, those events take place to the right part of the picture that you see up here on the screen. Next slide, please. The sudden violence lasted only a few minutes and not unexpectedly transpired with military precision, since the veterans in Caesar's entourage not only vastly outnumbered Bibulus' supporters, but also possessed superior fighting skills due to their years of military service. Still, these men were clearly under orders not to kill, but only to inflict physical harm, which would terrorize Caesar's enemies. His immediate purpose, of course, was to prevent any maneuvers which would stop passage of the land law. The Roman constitution provided a consul like Bibulus and the allied tribunes extensive powers to block legislation. Caesar, of course, knew that he could not win. So rather than follow the law and accept defeat, he encouraged, organized, and led a violent attack on his colleague and his political enemies. However, of greater importance to Caesar, failure to succeed would represent an enormous and perhaps fatal blow to his political and military aspirations. Only a few Roman scholars might have heard the name Caesar had he not employed violence at this moment. Of course, his allies and those who benefited from the law supported him despite the illegal tactics he used to see to its enactment. Once the forum had been cleared of opposition, Caesar was free to start the voting. The law passed. The veterans and the poor would get their land. The overwhelming display of force frightened would-be opponents, not just on April 4th, but for the rest of the year. Bibulus retired to the safety of his house. He would not reappear in public for 8 months until December 29th, the last day of the year. Next slide, please. The departure of Bibulus and his allies and the continuing threat of veterans who were still in the city allowed Caesar to control the political process. He now possessed the power to deliver a legislative program to reward his allies, his constituents, and ultimately himself. The gridlock which had plagued the system had been broken by violence. During the next few weeks, by far the most important law to be passed was the Lex Vatinia, the Vatinian law, which provided Caesar with an extraordinary command. Next slide, please. After the expiration of his consulship at the end of 59 BC, Caesar would then become proconsul as a result of this law, governor of the provinces of Transalpine and Cisalpine Gaul for 5 years with an army of 4 legions. Next slide, please. And you see Transalpine Gaul is southern France, Cisalpine Gaul is northern Italy. Both provinces at the time were on the northern frontiers of the Roman Empire. This proconsulship, this governorship, presented Caesar with limitless opportunities for military glory, the acquisition of great wealth through plunder, and last but not least, continuing legal immunity from prosecution for crimes committed while consul. Caesar's enemies had intended that once his term as consul had ended, he would be sent to survey the tracts and forests of Italy, meaning he would have no opportunity to win military glory or great wealth. They also believed his many transgressions as consul would provide a fruitful line of attack in the courts. Thanks to the violence of April 4th, which made the Vatinian law possible, events played out differently. From 58 to 50 BC, Caesar used his army to conquer all Gaul, thereby establishing his military reputation in the process. He then turned against Rome. On January 10th, 49 BC, he led his soldiers across the Rubicon River, precipitating Rome's 6th civil war. The fighting would drag on for 4 years before Caesar finally triumphed. Many Romans died during that war, though the death toll would have been much higher if not for Caesar's clementia, his mercy. He spared many defeated enemies, including, fatefully, Marcus Junius Brutus and Gaius Cassius Longinus. Next slide, please. In 45, the victorious Caesar proclaimed himself dictator for 10 years. In February 44 BC, he declared himself dictator for life, clearly indicating he had no intention of relinquishing power or of restoring the Republic. In the end, Rome's Republic could not cope with countless major problems or with the tremendous ambition of corrupt senators. Caesar's career clearly illustrates this. He was ambitious and corrupt, as well as smart and charismatic. He was willing to do anything to acquire power, wealth, and glory. His own personal advancement was far more important to him than the Constitution or to the safety of the Republic. He was supported by a significant number of Roman citizens willing to fight and, if necessary, die to help Caesar's career. They saw him as a leader, fighting for their interests against the corrupt, conservative elite represented by Bibulus and Cato. This led to those few pivotal moments of violence in front of the Temple of Castor in the Forum on April 4th that would transform the Roman Republic. Without the events of April 4th, Caesar and his allies would not have taken temporary control of the state and, unopposed, passed the Lex Vatinium. Had there been no violence on April 4th, Caesar's enemies would have blocked his governorship, and rather than conquer Gaul, he would have instead spent 58 surveying the tracts and the forests of Italy. Or he would have been hauled into court and convicted of various crimes as his enemies had intended. He never would have crossed the Rubicon, and he never would have become dictator. Thus, the story does not end happily and is indeed a cautionary tale. April 4th, 59 BC marked the beginning of the end of the Free State as the Republic eventually succumbed to violence and to civil war. The monarchy later established by Caesar's great nephew and heir Augustus would degenerate into despotism as political freedom vanished from the Western world for more than 1,000 years. And now we turn to Professor Watts, who will discuss our second important date, March 15th, 44 BC, the Ides of March.
Thank you so much, Steve. I'm going to share my slides. So Steve, I think that was a wonderful discussion of the year that made Caesar, and I'm going to focus on the year that unmade Caesar. In fact, the day that unmade Caesar. I'm going to tell the story of the Ides of March and the 5 days that followed the assassination of Julius Caesar. And those 5 days are almost unparalleled in the 2200-year history of the Roman world, because very few days in that span of time proved more consequential than those that followed the murder of Caesar. These were the days that decided whether Caesar would be cast in the Tiber as a tyrant or honored as a god. These were the days that decided whether Caesar's acts would be annulled or whether they would remain law. And perhaps most importantly, those were the days that decided whether Rome would remain a republic or would instead open itself to a new form of government. But with so much at stake, it's perhaps a dirty little secret that on the Ides of March, no one actually knew what Caesar's murder meant. Nothing went as planned. Everyone panicked. And after Caesar breathed his last, no one had any clear idea what would come next. The world's largest city, at the heart of the greatest empire the Mediterranean had ever known, nearly imploded until one of the world's greatest orations pulled it back from the brink and inadvertently opened the door for Octavian, the future Emperor Augustus, to eventually use the legacy of Caesar that was cemented in those 5 days to build a career for himself. But none of this was remotely imaginable on the morning of March 15, 44 BC. The city was calm, with some scheduled gladiatorial combats and a routine Senate meeting, the most exciting things on the day's calendar. Julius Caesar, the winner of a civil war that had ended a little more than a year before, was planning to leave in 3 days for a major military campaign against the Parthian Empire in Iraq. He'd spent the preceding months constructing a government that could keep the Republic running while he was away. And this sort of administrative work was essential because Rome tended to fall into chaos whenever Caesar's steadying hand had wandered too far. So when Caesar was away fighting his civil war against Pompey the Great, there had been riots about debts, rent prices, and military pay. And Caesar's return had always stabilized the city, but Parthia was a long way from Rome, and Caesar needed to build a structure that would keep the capital under control during what seemed like it would be a long absence. And so Caesar tried to solve this problem by hoarding power. From 46 onwards, he held the office of dictator, getting renewed appointments to this emergency position that was supposed to be held for no more than 6 months. And then, as Steve said, in the first months of 44 BC, Caesar arranged for this emergency office to become permanent. And you see on this coin, the legend, Dict Perpet Caesar. This is Caesar's perpetual dictatorship. By early 44, Caesar's experiments in autocracy had alarmed some Romans to such a degree that graffiti began appearing around the city on statues of Brutus, the man that Romans credited with expelling the kings and founding their republic. And the Vandals asked Brutus, in effect, "Where are you when we need you?" Some of the graffiti even called on Brutus's descendants to prove that they were worthy of the name. And they had one particular person in mind, Marcus Junius Brutus. Now, Marcus Junius Brutus had linked his public profile more closely to the principled defense of Rome's liberty than any other living Roman. Brutus was, of course, someone who claimed descent from the Brutus who founded the Republic. And when Brutus served as moneyer in 54 BC, he launched his political brand by attaching his name to 2 silver coin types. This is one of them. This one, as you see, the front featured the portrait and the name of the goddess Libertas, while on the reverse, what we see is an image of Brutus, the original Brutus, the founder of the Republic, walking with his lictors who are carrying the fasces. And beneath it, of course, is the helpful title Brutus. The second coin he issued in some ways was even more interesting because it was a coin that showed a portrait of Brutus with an identifying legend on the front and a portrait of a man named Servilius Ahala, another politician from whom Brutus claimed descent, who had made his name by murdering a man named Spurius Maelius in the 5th century BC because Maelius had aspired to become king. And so Marcus Junius Brutus built his political brand on the use of the images of the founder of the Roman Republic and the tyrannicide who saved it from an aspiring king. An ambitious Roman senator named Gaius Cassius forced Brutus to decide how seriously he was going to take his commitment to Roman liberty. Now, both Brutus and Cassius had served with Pompey the Great in the initial stages of the civil war against Caesar before ultimately asking Caesar's clemency and then receiving it and accepting prominent positions in government from Caesar. But both Brutus and Cassius had become disenchanted with Caesar's growing autocracy. And so Cassius found a group of other senators who felt similarly, and they decided that Caesar must be killed. But the window to do this was quite narrow because they felt it was essential to kill Caesar before he departed for his Parthian expedition on March 19th. And if they didn't do this, they felt the murder might never actually happen. And so the Senate meeting on March 15th was the time when they decided this was the last best opportunity to kill Caesar. Now, on the Ides of March, March 15th, 44, the Senate assembled in the great theater complex constructed a couple of decades before by Caesar's old rival, Pompey. As Caesar entered the building, one of the conspirators stopped the dictator to ask a favor. And when Caesar turned to answer, the conspirator grabbed Caesar's robe, pulled it from his neck, and then urged his fellow plotters to attack. They exposed concealed daggers and set upon the dictator beneath a statue of Pompey, stabbing him 23 times. Now, what's interesting about this is all of the assailants had extensive military training. Many of them had probably killed men before, but an autopsy that was conducted after Caesar's death revealed that only one of the 23 wounds inflicted by the senators was actually fatal. Even Caesar's assassins, it seems, were uneasy with the deed they'd committed and its implications. And this apprehension extended to Rome as a whole. Now, Brutus had chosen the meeting of the Senate as a moment for the assassination, in part because he imagined that even those senators who didn't know about the plot would immediately applaud its success. And Brutus had even composed a speech celebrating the reestablishment of Roman liberty that he believed Caesar's murder had achieved. But Brutus never got to give this speech. Most senators fled in terror, and as news of Caesar's death spread across Rome, panic followed. So gladiators fled the theater before they could perform. Audiences ran just behind them. Crowds spilled out into the marketplaces, plundering shops as the shopkeepers escaped. And people who reached their homes dared not go out again. They barred their windows, shut their doors, and prepared to defend their houses from the tiled roofs that in an emergency could be broken up and made into lethal missiles. It was March 15th. No one knew how to respond to a murder that evoked the aesthetically seductive concept of liberty, but actually threatened to reignite civil war. Caesar was dead, but it remained unclear whether Rome could stay together without him at its center. And shockingly, the conspirators had no backup plan when the Senate emptied in panic instead of erupting in applause. The consul Mark Antony fled to his house, fearing that he might be the next one killed. And then, as the conspirators merged into the city, they were disconcerted to see the city panicking rather than celebrating. And perhaps for the first time, Brutus, Cassius, and their fellow conspirators realized that they had not truly understood neither what Caesar had accomplished, nor what their fellow citizens thought about the dictator. And shocked by the city that greeted them, the conspirators rushed to the Capitoline Hill. And so you see the Capitoline again. This is the same slide as Steve's. The Capitoline is at the far sort of upper left of this. And the conspirators fled to the Capitoline and then fortified their positions on the Capitoline by hiring gladiators and bribing people to take their side. And they had good reason to worry. Lepidus, Caesar's deputy, controlled the only army that was currently in the city of Rome. And Lepidus saw that he could use the soldiers' demands for vengeance to position himself as a credible heir to the dictator. And by the morning of the 16th, Lepidus had used some of these troops to seize the Forum. So here you see the view that Brutus and Cassius would have seen of the Forum now occupied by Lepidus's troops. And as the sun rose over Lepidus's camp in the Forum, three crucial figures had not yet decided how to respond. So Brutus and Cassius remained on the Capitol with this view, looking out over Lepidus's army. Hiding in his house, which was just across the Forum from the Capitol, Mark Antony too had yet to recover from the shock of Caesar's murder. And March 16th dawned. Now each of these men soon recovered their bearings. By mid-morning on the 16th, Brutus decided to address the crowd in the Forum with a speech that defended his actions while also affirming that Caesar's veterans would receive the rewards the dictator had promised him. Now, this was not the inspired speech that Brutus had planned to give to the Senate the day before. It was instead a bow to the reality that troops recruited by Caesar now controlled the Forum, and his angry veterans roamed the streets of the city. But Brutus's acknowledgement of the legitimacy of Caesar's promises to his soldiers had opened an avenue of attack that Antony would soon exploit. And that afternoon, Antony began fomenting his plan. Antony held a meeting with Lepidus and some other leading Caesarian supporters to plan their response. And Antony had, over the past day, come to calculate the exact way that he wanted to play these events, because he understood that Lepidus's position grew weaker the longer that Lepidus restrained the army from violence. Antony also knew that Brutus had made a pretty serious tactical error by acknowledging the validity of some of Caesar's actions. And this error then opened up the possibility that more of the dictator's legislative legacy could be salvaged. And Antony also understood the immense benefits that he could unlock for himself if he came to be seen as the man who had salvaged these things for Caesar's followers without using violence as Lepidus perhaps intended. Now, Antony's meeting with Lepidus adjourned with a call to convene the Senate at the Temple of Tellus on the 17th. The Temple of Tellus is near to Antony's house. And Antony then secured Caesar's papers from his widow Calpurnia, and then arrived at an approach to this Senate meeting that would allow him to stabilize the situation long enough that he might use those documents to again seize the initiative. And so on March 17th, the senators turned up to the Temple of Tellus to find it surrounded both by Lepidus's troops and a group of Caesar's veterans. And Antony then ran the meeting, and he made the day's most powerful point. He explained that declaring Caesar a tyrant who had taken power illegally would require the Senate to invalidate the acts that Caesar had taken while he was in power. And that would, of course, include Caesar's awarding of offices to most of the people in the Senate. And so if the Senate wanted to declare Caesar a tyrant, they would all need to agree to give up the honors and offices he'd bestowed on them and stand for election to try to win those things back. And the vain and foolish senators wanted no part of that. So Antony proposed a compromise. He proposed that the Senate ratify all of Caesar's acts while extending an amnesty to his murderers. Now, this compromise offered safety to the conspirators, and it preserved what Caesar had done for the soldiers, senators, and veterans. And then Antony got an important concession, because he got the Senate to agree that Caesar's will would be read aloud and that Caesar would be given a public funeral. And the grateful Senate then approved this compromise without realizing that Antony had just baited a trap. Antony had now been given a text, written in Caesar's own words, around which to base a powerful and evocative public ceremony that would define the dictator's legacy for the people of Rome. And a few days later, he used it. When Caesar's will was read out, probably on March 20th, though we don't know the exact date, The Roman people learned that the man that they had been told was a tyrant had left money to every Roman living in the city. And he'd even turned his private gardens along the Tiber River over to the citizens of Rome as a public park. Now, the money was appreciated, but the park was perhaps even more valuable in a crowded, filthy city of 1 million people. But two other provisions of the will were equally important. First, the will provided for the adoption of Octavian, the 18-year-old grandson of Caesar's sister, and it named Octavian the heir to Caesar's estate. Secondly, the will named a number of other beneficiaries, some of whom were assassins who had killed Caesar. And this fact underlined for everybody the personal nature of the betrayal those assassins had made to Caesar. And suddenly, nearly the entire city came to the conclusion that the conspirators had committed a serious and horrible sacrilege. Not only had they violated the public vows that they'd taken to protect Caesar, but many of them had actually betrayed an intimate friend who loved them enough that he gave them resources in his will. They were not heroes fighting for the Republic. They were ungrateful blowhards dressing their jealousy up in the robes of liberty. And this set the stage for Caesar's funeral. Antony arranged for Caesar's body to be brought to the Forum. It was then quickly surrounded by mourning crowds. The body had not been cleaned, and Caesar's gaping wounds remained visible beneath the dried blood that had pooled around them. Antony then rose to give a funeral oration that was at that moment even more powerful than the famous speech that Shakespeare would later put in his mouth. Antony said few words of his own. The speech instead largely repeated text included in the honors that the conspirators and the rest of the Senate had voted to Caesar, with Antony simply adding small pieces of commentary. So the crowd heard how Caesar's conquest of Gaul had avenged the Gallic sack of Rome in 390 BC. They heard how he'd been voted an exemplar of clemency by the Senate, by senators like Brutus and Cassius, who had received that clemency. They heard how he'd given refuge to all of his enemies who sought it. And they'd heard how all the senators had sworn that Caesar was to be sacred and inviolable. And yet now his brutalized body lay before them, destroyed by some of the very same men who had sworn these very same things weeks or even days before. And as the anger of the people neared its boiling point, Antony lifted Caesar's blood-stained robe high above his head, and someone else raised a wax image of Caesar's body up on a mechanical device that spun around and showed the crowd all 23 places where Caesar had been stabbed. The people, the historian Appian would later write, could no longer bear the most pitiful sight displayed before them. They erupted into the streets, fired by an uncontrollable cocktail of anger and grief. Mobs burned the meeting place where Caesar had been stabbed. And then they searched the city for Caesar's murderers so that they too might suffer some punishment for their faithlessness. A group of Caesar's supporters then set up an altar to the deceased dictator on the site where his remains had been burned. The Emperor Augustus would later build a temple around that altar. And you see here the remains of the altar and the temple, and this is the space itself. Others even began hunting for Brutus and Cassius in order to avenge the dictator. Now, Antony's display had convinced a significant number of Romans that Brutus was wrong, that Caesar was not a tyrant whose removal meant liberation. He was instead a Roman hero whose death portended disorder and tragedy. The meaning of the murder was now determined, and 3 weeks later, the future Emperor Augustus would start his career by claiming that he would avenge the death of his adopted father without compromise, without reconciliation. Roman political life now set off on a new and entirely different path. Now, we like to think that our modern world exists in an unprecedented reality where events unfold so quickly that we can't even think before we react. But these days in 44 BC show that this is not true. More than 2,000 years before Twitter, Romans also had to deal with a profoundly unstable political situation in which news flowed quickly, people reacted nearly instantaneously, and the significance of Caesar's murder evolved on an hourly basis. It's perhaps not surprising that Romans manage their 24-hour news cycle about as well as we do. But there's perhaps still some consolation for us that we're not alone in navigating these challenges. We have many fellow travelers across history, even if they may not offer us any better solutions than we now can find. And with that, I want to turn things back to Shelby to begin the Q&A.
Hi, everybody. We have a lot of questions already and a lot of different types of questions, some political, some not at all. And I'm going to start with one that directly relates to historical practice and assigning validity to what we read. So we have a question about, do we know for sure that was actually Caesar's will? Because it was so convenient for Antony. Tony, you want to take that?
Yeah,
Let that handle that.
I think to the degree that we can be certain, yes. There's always this question, and I think probably that question might have been raised in antiquity as well, but there is not a direct contest of that will, and I think Antony was not expecting what was actually in that will. I think that's part of why we have a good reason to assume that this probably is a legitimate document, because Antony, I think, was expecting to be either named as Caesar's political heir or in some way be, marked as the person who should follow in Caesar's legacy. And he didn't know who Octavian was. And so for Octavian to be put in that position, I think suggests quite strongly that this is not a document that Antony created. Another very famous will that I think we do have some reason to suspect is Antony's will that Augustus brings forward to justify attacking Antony and Cleopatra about 15 years after that. That will, I think, is suspicious. Caesar's will, I think, is not suspicious because the person who produced it actually had his plans complicated by what that document actually contained.
Thank you. I'm looking through all of these and trying to group them in some ways. Before I continue, though, I wanted to say that we will be posting this recording. And once we've added closed captioning and so on, and we'll send a message to everybody who registered for this event to let them know. So if you're feeling that you missed a part or you want more information, you will have your chance. There's another sort of historical validity question about different reports about Caesar's death, whether he fought back, and how much do we actually, besides the fact that he died, think we can prove any of the events around his death?
I think that the challenge there is the people who are writing this, in many cases, the best accounts come much later. Now, I think in the case of Suetonius, who does write about this almost 150 years after it happened, Suetonius's evidence for Caesar's death, for the actual narration of this, some of this is pretty good because Suetonius worked in the imperial bureaucracy. And so he had access to a lot of materials that were sort of preserved through the reign of Augustus and elsewhere. So his material for Caesar, including the autopsy report, I think is pretty good. We have reactions from people like Cicero, who I don't remember if Cicero's account is detailed enough, but most of the narrations we have actually come significantly later than this.
Steve, this one might be for you. It's a question about that not much mention was made of the first triumvirate. And was Caesar so ambitious that Pompey and Crassus were irrelevant or powerless to stop him?
Well, unfortunately, I only had 20 minutes, or I would have brought them in too, because they play a big role in the events of the 60s and the 50s and beyond. The first triumvirate, Caesar, Crassus, and Pompey, was formed after Caesar was elected, but before he became consul, so December of 60 BC. And it is also probable that both Crassus and Pompey helped Caesar get elected. Pompey was Rome's most famous general at the time. Crassus was possibly Rome's wealthiest man. They pooled their resources and helped to get Caesar elected to the consulship. And of course, in return, they expected Caesar to pass laws that they wanted. Most notably, the law for the veterans, those were Pompey's veterans. Right? So he wanted that law passed to reward his men for serving so well under his leadership in the East. Crassus is eventually killed in battle in 53 BC, fighting against the Parthians. And it's fascinating because he was, like I said, maybe the wealthiest guy in Rome, maybe one of the three most powerful political figures in Rome, but that didn't matter because he did not yet have military glory. And he apparently was jealous of both Caesar's success in Gaul and Pompey's success in the East and elsewhere. So he got himself appointed general against the Parthians in the east and went off and got killed. So he wasn't around by the end of the decade. Pompey did try to stop Caesar, and that was the Sixth Civil War. Caesar was able to defeat Pompey, and Pompey was assassinated after fleeing from the Battle of Pharsalus in 48 BC. So Caesar was able to eliminate Pompey. So Pompey did indeed try to stop him, but failed.
We have a number of people interested in what happened to the assassins afterwards, and there were a lot of them, but you might address some key moments.
So I'll take that. I think that's more my more the aftermath question. But I think Brutus and Cassius are the most notable, of course. And what ends up happening is by the time Octavian gets to Rome and asserts his claim to Caesar's legacy, Brutus and Cassius realize it's time to flee. So Brutus and Cassius go to the east, and what they do in the east is something that almost sort of puts to bed the notion that they're actually liberators, because Brutus and Cassius build a large army by plundering people in the east and basically attacking cities and capturing large amounts of money and plunder. And the Ides of March coin that I started with is actually issued by them to pay troops so that they can fight Octavian and Antony. But in the end, this is a battle that they lose. And Brutus and Cassius both end up dead at the end of this campaign. And so Brutus and Cassius's story is over, more or less. And with it is more or less the end of the story of the sort of resistance within the Republic.
Right.
We have a few questions as well, both about why he was deified and how he comes down to us as still a hero rather than just some kind of violent despot.
Well, part of the reason he was deified was because it was in Octavius or Augustus's best interest, because that made him a son of a god, and that helped his rise to power. And it's something that you see often throughout history. The supporters of a politician, in this case Caesar, do whatever they can to glorify him after his death, and that was part of that.
Yeah, I think that the other thing that's really important in this is the structural foundation of the empire and the grafting of the legacy of Caesar through Augustus into this basic idea of what imperial power was. So I think you see a really interesting moment in the period after 96 when people like Plutarch and Suetonius are writing about Caesar, where some of what Caesar did, they conceptually oppose, but they can't actually outright attack him because Caesar has been kind of embedded into the structure of the imperial, the imperial state. And so Caesar is, in a sense, a person whose reputation is protected by the political structure of the empire. And this, I think, prevents a really aggressive reevaluation of Caesar until he's so deep in the past that the legacy is just fixed.
Well, people would get in trouble later on for glorifying Brutus and Cassius.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Cato in particular.
And Cato
people
too.
died for celebrating Cato's resistance to Caesar.
Right.
This is a change of tone. Do either of you like historical fiction? And if so, do you like Robert Harris?
Yes, and I've never read Robert Harris.
Good enough. Ed, you don't like historical fiction?
I like some historical fiction, but I also have never read Robert Harris. So
Okay.
I guess we fail.
Yeah.
I'm going to throw a few slightly different ones in here for a minute. Why did Brutus have the authority to issue coins?
So the office of moneyer is a relatively junior appointment that is an office created. We start seeing them in the 2nd century BC, and they start really putting their own imprint on coins starting around the 130s BC. What's done basically is the Senate gives moneyers a fixed amount of money or a fixed amount of bullion they're supposed to coin, and then the moneyers coin it using designs that they want. And so Brutus is holding an office that enables him to mint coins. And so like other moneyers, Brutus chooses the designs he wants to use. And for a lot of these moneyers, what they tend to do is to take things that advertise their family legacy in a way that kind of gives them a jump start to their political career because it defines their brand. It's their initial communication with the public about who they are and what they stand for. And so, so Brutus has this authority through an office that he acquired, and then he's minting under senatorial authority. And so the coins in 54 are coins that he's issuing in a perfectly constitutional way. The coins in the 40s with the Ides of March on it, he is not issuing in the same way. He's issuing those as Imperator was paying his armies. And so he's using a kind of extra constitutional means to issue those coins.
We have a couple of questions about Cleopatra and her effect on Caesar's reputation, and anything about his political life that you might care to comment on.
Well, she was actually in Rome when he was assassinated, living just across the river from the city. And that may have been part of the motivation, because they feared maybe Caesar at some point might try to marry her and then make himself Rex or king, make her his queen, and leave the whole world to their son. At least that's one of the theories.
And his son was there too, so that was pretty
Ptolemy Caesarion.
tough. Well, I would like to ask a question about the way speeches and unexpected events have the power to change completely how people think about an event. And just bringing us up to the present and thinking about how Cicero and Sallust say that a key factor in political division is when politicians are no longer patriots, but they're partisans for their own party, which is a debate going on today. And I wondered if each of you would take just a moment to say one of the lessons learned that most impresses you about watching closely what happened thousands of years ago with Caesar.
Steve, you go ahead first.
Partisan politics are bad, just as Sallust said. And keep in mind, I mean, obviously I was just focusing on Caesar, but he is not the first one to do that type of thing in Rome. This was a problem that had been going back since 133 BC. And after that, you have more and more politicians, not all of them, of course, but more and more politicians willing to do anything to win. And Caesar was simply the most successful of those politicians. But you have Roman politicians who are unable or unwilling to fix some of the major problems that Rome faced, which means the problems were never addressed. And as I mentioned, gridlock in Rome was fairly common because it was so much easier to block things. Had Caesar not attacked Bibulus in the Forum, Bibulus would have been within his constitutional rights, or one of the tribunes could have vetoed it as well, to actually prevent the vote, even though he was against the majority opinion at that time. So there's gridlock in Rome. Politicians are unwilling or unable to help or solve the many problems that Rome faced. They are fighting to gain glory, military glory, political auctoritas or political power in Rome, and they're willing to do anything to get it. And that's ultimately what's going to destroy the Republic.
I think that's definitely true. I think what I might say is, when we're thinking about political orations, there's a lot of history. Orations are just noise in the background. When people know how they feel about an event, or an event is occurring in a structure where the implications of the event are clear, you're not going to change history through a powerful oration. And I think those of us who lived through the Obama presidency can see that there's oftentimes a real significant disconnect between powerful oratory and actual, tangible shifts in opinion. But I think what happened in March 15th of 44 was so significant and so devastating in how it shook the understanding of how Rome's politics worked and what Caesar's legacy meant, that people didn't know what they thought. The system and the rules that guided people's behaviors had broken down, and people were legitimately trying to make sense of that moment in a way that isn't usual in history. And so in those moments, speeches actually do make a significant impact, because if people are looking to figure out what things mean, if you can provide a convincing case that you understand it and that your interpretation of it is correct, that can very much change the way that people respond. And I think Brutus's speech on the 16th was a failed opportunity. And Antony's use of Antony's speech at Caesar's funeral was an opportunity that really did change completely the way that people were thinking about what had happened over the past 5 days. But I think under different circumstances, there was no possibility, if Caesar was still alive, that anybody could make a speech on March 20th that would have changed the world. So I think that that's maybe the way that I would sort of calibrate it. Speeches can really dramatically change history, but history has to be ready for it, I think.
Oh, I think you're muted, Joey.
I'd like to say to everybody that we know to be kind about your time, but we have a lot of questions left, and I think our speakers are willing to keep going for a while. So I just wanted to announce that we're around when you might expect us to be done, but we're going to hang in there because people are interested, and there's still a lot of different kinds of questions coming. Here's a political one again. Did Octavian reject the notion of clementia after seeing how it had affected his uncle?
I think we probably both have answers to this. Yes, absolutely.
Yes.
and I think it's exactly for that reason. I mean, personally, I think that one of the things that deeply conditioned Caesar's behavior was seeing what happened when he was on the other side of a civil war. He was on the side of Marius when the Marians and Cinna lost the civil war with Sulla. And Caesar saw what happened to people who didn't get clementia. He saw what's happened to a society where people basically were punished for this kind of behavior. And I think that scarred Caesar deeply. He really didn't want to do that. And so clementia is something that he felt needed to be done for the good of Rome. And you see this even in the 60s when he's speaking about Catiline. And he's talking about the need to not use violence, not execute people without trials, not violate people's rights. And I think what Octavian learned quite clearly is that doesn't work. If you're playing a political game in the late Roman Republic, you're playing with your life. And if you lose, you don't live. And so with those stakes, I think Octavian realized he didn't have the luxury of being exercising clemency and forgiving his enemies. And so, yeah, I think he completely learned from Caesar's lesson that was a mistake and he wasn't going to do it.
Well, he really had two examples. He had Sulla and he had Caesar. Sulla dies of natural causes. After killing all his enemies, Caesar doesn't.
Yeah.
That puts it very succinctly. We have a question about the role of Decimus. And if you could talk a little more about him in the plot.
Decimus is a pretty, if you had to sort of put a bullseye on the person who's the most disloyal of Caesar's people, it's Decimus Brutus. You know, he actually is very, Caesar trusted him a great deal and he participates in the assassination. And then in the kind of aftermath, Decimus goes and goes to the city of Mutina, and his actions there actually precipitate the set of events that get basically make Augustus Augustus. I mean, it really is the very beginning of Augustus getting together military power, and it precipitates Augustus going against the Senate and going against the Republic in a very explicit way. So I think Decimus Brutus, if you had to say that somebody played this the worst of anyone with the most destructive consequences, Decimus Brutus, I think, gets my vote for that.
This is a what if question, especially given that the people who wanted to assassinate him didn't seem to think, as you said, of an alternate to being successful and praised for it. If they had succeeded, would they have succeeded if they had gone about the assassination differently?
The only way they would have succeeded is if they had finally realized the necessity of taking care of the soldiers. And that was the key, because they had a number of opportunities, especially you were talking about Mutina. After the Battle of Mutina, the Senate and Cicero had promised the soldiers that were fighting for their cause that they would be rewarded. And then once the battle is over, then suddenly they say, well, you know, we don't have enough money in the treasury. Sorry, you guys are gonna have to wait. And that plays right into Octavian's hands. So the amazing thing about Brutus and Cassius, I've always thought, was the fact that they didn't learn from recent Roman Republican history, that you're not going to be able to secure control of the state unless you do have the backing of the soldiers. And had they moved quickly to secure the support of Caesar's soldiers, which might have been impossible anyway because of the way the soldiers felt about Caesar. But had they done so, then it might have been different. Had they said, look, we killed Caesar because he's a tyrant, but we are going to make sure you get all your land and money, and we will take care of you, then things might have been a little different.
Yeah, I think that Steve's exactly right there. I think one important thing that probably Brutus and Cassius didn't understand, and Pompey, they should have learned from Pompey, is that the troops that had served under Caesar were far better than anything you could have put together to oppose them. They were the best soldiers that the Roman military possibly ever had, and they were certainly better than any kinds of recruits or raw recruits you could put together. And so you needed to not only take care of the soldiers, you needed particularly to take care of those soldiers.
We're going to wind down. I'm wanting to ask you just two more questions, though. Is a republic fatally flawed by ambitious men or women compared with those who want to believe in a republic? How would you both see the best way forward politically for those who are entering politics today?
Ed?
I actually had a really interesting conversation about this weekend, where we were looking at Sallust and Cicero and the ways that they kind of conceive of what a republic is and what law is. And I think if you combine kind of the observations of Sallust and Cicero, what they would say is, ambition in a society and in a structure that kind of channels that ambition in an appropriate way is completely compatible with a republic that's functional. But when the laws or norms or customs start breaking down, and that channeling of ambition in an appropriate and legal mechanism is not possible anymore, or those structures are not strong enough to prevent you from doing things like Caesar did and just doing things that break with those conventions completely, then basically the society has no ability to channel that ambition in a positive direction. And you start seeing people do all kinds of things that are contrary to the best interests of the republic. And so I think you need to have, a combination of channeling of behaviors in a virtuous way. This would be the sort of Sallustian way of thinking about it. And then also robust structures, both legal and customary structures that make sure that you have that channeling happening both naturally, but also sort of structurally. So I guess I would say that a republic, when it's strong, ambition is not a vice at all, it's a virtue. But when a republic is weak and it can't channel that ambition in ways that follow recognized and established and agreed upon rules, then ambition becomes really, really destructive, and pretty quickly too. I don't know, Steve, do you feel like similarly?
Yeah. Well, no, I was thinking about our founding fathers and how they always looked to Rome as an example of checks and balances. That is exactly what you just said, how they were able to challenge those ambition or channel those ambitions to make sure that there was always somebody or some group that had power to check someone or some group that got too powerful. So definitely, I mean, as long as the different branches of government are strong enough, then it can accommodate those types of ambitions. What happened in Rome, of course, was those other institutions or individuals were not strong enough to hold people like Caesar.
And the last question, which relates to some of the things you've answered already, is why conservatives would have objected to giving land to veterans and urban poor when there were many reasons to do so. And was it a philosophical, legal? What were the main ways they positioned themselves?
Yeah, I mean, there was, Cicero is our best source probably for the conservative political philosophy, but they considered using the wealth of the state to help the poor as generally unacceptable, that was not an acceptable use of it. And you see it is pretty amazing because you see some comments made by Cicero and others that are very similar to politicians throughout history that do not want to help the average citizen. So Cato and Bibulus and their followers stop or do everything they can to try and stop Caesar, because this is against their political philosophy, that this is not the way the wealth of the empire is supposed to be used.
Ed, anything you want to throw in there? Or you done?
I think that one of the things that's also important is they were philosophically opposed, but they're also personally opposed. And one of the things that you see with Cato in the 60s is Cato is particularly concerned about Pompey, and he feels that undercutting Pompey's support with his veterans by preventing this kind of land distribution is actually good politics. It's something he opposed on principle, but it's also for him good politics because he saw Pompey, not Caesar, as the biggest threat. And so I think you do see that as well. There's principle, but then there's also just sort of pure nitty gritty, like disgusting,
Right.
hands dirty politics.
And especially in Rome, more so because you had so many intermarriages between important political families. So Pompey's wife during the 60s, Pompey divorces her, and he divorces her because he claimed that she was unfaithful. And immediately that turned her two brothers against him. And they spent all their time trying to block laws passed by Pompey, or the laws that Pompey wanted. A big reason why Caesar had to pass the Lex Agraria, the Julia Agraria, was because those brothers had blocked it in the previous 2 years. The same is true of Caesar. Cato hated Caesar personally. So there's often, as like Ed said, there's often personal motives that go along with the political agenda.
I want to thank you both enormously for educating us and answering our questions. And I want to thank everybody for joining us. I'm sorry we couldn't get to every question. I tried to answer some privately. Remember, you will find out from us later when this will be posted. And we will end with a slide showing you the two books by our two speakers so that you can go read them if you haven't. And we will look forward to seeing you at another program soon. So thank you all very, very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all.